Hey everybody, good evening, happy Monday. Thanks for joining. Give people a little bit of time to jump on and then we'll get started. How's everybody doing? Let's hear from you in the chat. What's going on? How was your Monday? How was your weekend? Did you join a protest? What did you get up to? Let us know. I'm interested in hearing it. That's where I'll probably start. So I'm going to start by talking about a couple things, some housekeeping type things. We've been trying to keep everybody up to date on the coronavirus state of emergency. So our state of emergency has again been extended to the end of June. And that's relevant to us because we are using that as a gauge of when to start canvassing again. So we are not planning to start our in-person canvassing again yet. We're going to keep reassessing as every week goes by and see how we feel about that. But while we recognize that that's the best way for us to reach voters and have those one-to-one conversations that are so meaningful and important for our campaign, we just don't feel comfortable with it yet. I've talked about this before when we first decided to shut down in-person canvassing, but a ton of the people who work on our campaign and volunteer on our campaign don't have health insurance. A lot of the doors that we're knocking on are probably homes of people who don't have health insurance or might be immunocompromised or have other complications, and we don't want to be the reason to bring coronavirus to their doorstep. So we are going to keep checking every couple of weeks, see how things are trending, and so that we aren't acting as a conduit of infection. So that's an update on state of emergency, pandemic. The obviously other topic that is on everyone's mind continues to be the uprisings and protests against police brutality in our country. I did join a protest again last Friday, which I was incredibly happy to be a part of, and I want to thank the people who put it on for putting together such a great event where we were able to march from the riverfront to the courthouse. And what I in particular really appreciated about that march and that event is that we really got to hear from a lot of people who have been the victims of police brutality in our state. And I think it's incredibly important to remind each other and that this isn't a problem that happens somewhere else. You know, I think a lot of times stories from other states have made the national news, but that doesn't mean we haven't had our own stories. And the sign that I actually carried on Friday pointed that out. You know, I carried a sign that listed out the names of Jeremy McDowell and Yaheem Harris and Ricardo Hilton and Brandon Roberts. And there's so many more who we don't know the names of. Those are all people who have been shot and killed or shot and really gravely injured by police in our state. Jeremy McDowell was wheelchair bound and called the cops for help in crisis and was shot over a dozen times by multiple officers and killed. Yaheem Harris was accused of a carjacking and was shot moments after he stepped out of the car by the same officer who shot Jeremy McDowell, by the way. Ricardo Hilton was someone else who seemed to be in crisis and was potentially armed, but was shot and killed before any sort of de-escalation could have even happened. And we still don't even know the full story of what happened there last fall. And Brandon Roberts, again, a case where someone was in crisis and called the police for help and was dead within minutes of the police arriving and shot dead by the police. So these are all stories from our own backyard. And these aren't the only ones. You know, we've heard from mothers and fathers about their children who've been if not shot, brutalized, roughed up by police, just being over policed in general, being surveilled, feeling that they can't even walk outside their door without being watched or considered criminal. And these are things, again, that are happening in neighborhoods in our own cities and state. So this is not a problem that's far away. It's a repeated problem. This is why we know it's a systemic problem, because it's not one department, it's not one cop, it's widespread, and it exists in every single state. And that's why we're seeing protests in every single state, because people recognize that this is not a problem of simply reprimanding single officers or getting rid of bad apples, which is a phrase we've heard so much, yet people continue to forget what the second half of that phrase is, that a few bad apples spoil the barrel. It's not acceptable to have a few bad apples in something as potentially deadly as policing. If you drive a forklift and you hurt someone, you lose your job. And yet the same standard is not extended to policing. And it's something that is not just happening far away. And I think we really have to remember that and pay attention to what's happening in our own state, because that's a place that we can really directly affect change. And one of those ways is by showing up to protest. But I've been reflecting on a lot of what we're seeing from people in power, and that they are showing up to protest. They're showing up to marches. They're doing moments of silence. But it's one thing, it's okay to show solidarity with protesters. It's okay to show up. But the protest is a way for people who don't have power, whose voices go unheard, to make themselves heard, to come together and build power together and stand as a collective and make demands. While I appreciate politicians showing up to protest, they are the ones who actually have the power to enact the demands that the protesters are making. So it's not enough to give people credit for saying Black Lives Matter and showing up to a protest and saying we've got a real problem, when they are the people who can fix that problem. If you show solidarity and show up without following it up with legislation that you champion and actually fight to pass, it's not enough. And people are so angry right now, and you simply doing something that is for a photo op is only going to feed into that anger when you have real power that you could be using. I mean, I think everyone, maybe not everyone, I'm sure a lot of people saw the photo of representatives in the House and Senate kneeling today. And as an aside, I will say, I don't, unless they are trying to emulate the Colin Kaepernick kneeling, I think it really struck me as odd to choose to kneel for the length of time that a man had a knee on his neck, which killed him. Like it just feels a little strange to recreate the method of murder that was used against George Floyd, as an aside. But that is not nearly enough. That you can't, if you have real power, we need you to use it right now. And you can't be using it to keep status quo in place. Showing solidarity and doing it for the gram or putting photos up is not going to be enough anymore. People are tired, not only of police brutality, they're angry about the wages they make that are so low that it's impossible to survive, that they constantly have to worry about losing their housing, that they constantly have to worry about getting sick, and how poorer communities and blacker communities have higher rates of cancer, have been disproportionately affected by coronavirus, have higher rates of asthma and all kinds of disease, and yet get worse care on top of that. These are things that people are mad about. These are why protests and uprising are breaking out right now. And if you are a person who has power and you choose to attend a protest but not make change, it's not enough. And we can't give people credit for showing up when they are actually failing to use the power they have to make change, and actually standing in the way at times of the change that we actually need. So I think what we need to demand, and the way that we actually see from our elected officials that they truly stand with the communities who are demanding change right now, is to make that change happen, to actually work on fixing wealth inequality, to actually work on saying, how do we reallocate our resources to invest in ourselves and building public safety through healthy communities and educated communities and well-paid communities that are prosperous? That's what we need from elected officials right now, not photo ops and the equivalent of thoughts and prayers, not street art, not moments of silence. Like, those things are fine, but they can't be it. It has to be, yeah, that, and what else are you doing? Because otherwise, what are you holding onto that seat for? How are you using that seat to actually help people? We need to see it, and we need to see it now, and we need to continue protesting until it changes. You know, I think a lot of people maybe have seen the graphic that's been going around about how long some of the protests in the history of our country have lasted. And I think it's a good reminder that, like, you have to keep coming out. And when people tell you to stay home, when people say there's a curfew, when people say we need you to do this differently, that's when you come out. Because you have to keep showing up until you get the real change you need. Not just pledges, not just a commitment to study it, actual change voted on and passed and enacted. And that has to be change that takes on the concept of a policing as a whole, not just individual departments, that will take on the prison industrial complex that exists in our country, this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that we have that enriches both governments and private industry by locking people up, that creates companies that sell surveillance equipment and police training and military equipment and put that into our communities, that then gets used against us even though it was paid for with our own money. We need to break down that industrial complex. We need to break down the carceral approach to life that we have, the punitive approach to life, and really rethink what public safety really means. And this extends to prisons, it extends to ICE, anywhere that we're holding immigrants. It extends to FBI and the surveillance powers that we've given to the government. All of these things are a way to enact order and real, frankly, when it comes to some families, terror on them, because we're breaking up families. Even if your son or father or mother or sister isn't killed by police, if they're incarcerated, that's destroying a lot of families. It's destroying communities. It's destroying neighborhoods. So what can we do different? How can we reimagine public safety and invest in the things that actually make us safe, rather than investing in the things that break up communities and lock people away? And that's the stuff that these protests are going to continue to push for, and that we need to win. So, got some questions to hit. Okay, so we were doing, this one came in offline. We were doing some text over the weekend, and someone asked, what is your racial justice agenda? So here's some things I support. Again, if you want to see the full platform, you can go to jessfordelaware.com/issues. You can see all of that there. But the things that are in my racial justice platform are reparations for the descendants of slavery and genocide, or indigenous peoples who suffered genocide. We continue to see wealth gaps, income gaps, property gaps between the races, and it's because wealth with an income and possessions and property were systemically stolen, particularly from Black and indigenous people throughout the history of our country. We need to right that wrong. We've done it before. We paid reparations for Japanese internment. We absolutely can do it again. We need to commit to actually desegregating our schools. While it may not be allowed to be segregated outwardly, many schools still are. And that's done by straight districting lines. It's done by offering things like vouchers and choice that allow people who have the means to move their students to a different school. We have to end these things and actually create equitable funding systems for our schools and bring in education that is culturally aware and competent and can speak to the culture that students are coming from. We need to eradicate discrimination in housing, employment, finance, healthcare. I mean, the differences in medical outcomes between white and black people cannot continue, particularly when we're talking about like black maternal health, and the rates of black mothers dying in childbirth are out of control. We should be completely ashamed, and we need to fix these things. And we need to do that by, particularly when it comes to discrimination in housing and employment and lending that happens from banks. We have the rules in place to prevent a lot of that. We have no enforcement structure. So we need people that actually their job is to ensure that workplaces are not discriminating, that people actually know how they report these things, and that it actually gets taken care of rather than being put into a pipeline that's years long and doesn't get addressed. So it's not just creating new law, it's actually enforcing the law that we have there. Another piece is about environmental racism. This is incredibly relevant across the nation, but particularly in Delaware. Corporations have polluted communities throughout our country for as long as they have existed, but that pollution has happened far more and to a much more severe degree in blacker and browner communities, and it's led to higher cancer rates, it's led to shorter lifespans, and they need to pay and be accountable for doing that cleanup and ensuring that all the communities that they have polluted have clean land, clean air, and clean water. And finally, we need to be investing in actually increasing representation in places like education and in government particular, and in the leadership positions in those roles. I don't know if anybody has seen that kind of question that goes around a few times where it's like, how old were you when you had your first black teacher? And I have been through elementary school, high school, undergrad, and a graduate degree and never had a black teacher. And what does that mean for someone who's actually black, to never have a teacher who looks like them, has their experiences? Like, these are things that matter and make a difference in the outcomes of students, in the outcomes of the government and the legislation that gets put forward, and we are grossly lacking right now when it comes to that representation. So there are some things on my racial justice platform. All right. All right. Next question. This one comes up a bit. This one came in from Instagram, actually. And it was a question that I'm sure everyone's kind of heard. But the question was, how will you pay for Medicare for All or a Green New Deal? Why wouldn't we use carbon taxes or a higher gas tax to pay for those things? I'm going to start with the second question first. The reason that, first of all, higher gas tax is a regressive tax. What that means is that it costs poorer people more to pay a higher gas tax. So if we add taxes to gas at the pump, that is much harder for someone who is a lower income person to pay now to fill their gas tank than someone who's wealthier. It puts the burden on the wrong people. So that's why we don't look at tools like a gas tax. As far as carbon taxes, they simply won't get us there. Like, we need to be working toward limiting warming and getting off of fossil fuels by 2030. And carbon taxes, the best estimates that people put forward who champion carbon taxes, like Senator Coons, they're looking at maybe 2050 getting down, I think, by 50%. So they're not aggressive enough and effective enough to get us where we need to be. If in places where they have been successful, what they've actually been successful at is moving people off of coal to gas. I believe the UK is a good example of that, where people champion their carbon tax, but it was a tax that moved people from one fossil fuel to another fossil fuel, not off of fossil fuels. So that's why we don't fight for carbon taxes. So those are kind of Green New Deal pieces. I'm going to jump back to talking about paying for Medicare for all, because I think this is important and it comes up a lot, and I think it's sometimes gets frustrating for people to hear this question over and over, because we already pay for our health care. When we're talking about the Medicare for all bill that has been proposed, the estimate is that it'll cost about $3.2 to $3.4 trillion a year. They do these ranges over 10 years. That's why you hear the 32 trillion and the 34 trillion numbers. That's a 10-year number. So that's the estimate of what Medicare for all will cost. We are currently on track to spend $36 trillion over that same period on healthcare. So what we are currently on track to spend is anywhere from between $4 trillion and $2 trillion more than what we would spend if we moved to a Medicare for all system. And that's assuming healthcare costs don't skyrocket, which they very well could. And that's why you see some estimates that within 10 years we'll be spending $48 trillion. So I just want to put that out there right now. What we are spending now is estimated to be less than what we would spend on Medicare for all. So we already spend more than any other nation, but we receive worse outcomes. We have shorter life expectancies. People get less coverage. Like, even though you're spending all this money on your insurance, it doesn't actually cover what you might need, and you still need to spend more, which is why we spend so much more than other countries. So this is why people say Medicare for all would save us money and would actually result in better health outcomes. So right now, when we talk about those numbers, that's a fifth of our economy. And if we are getting such terrible outcomes, why are we not looking for ways to improve our health, which is what Medicare for all will do. Will ensure that people actually get the care that they need. So the way that we pay for it is we take the spending that we're doing and cut out the middleman that rations our care. The way we pay for it is by having a single payer system that allocates those payments out. And when we have one entity doing that versus this patchwork of various insurance companies, all with their own staffs, all with their own schemes and their payment methods and processes, the reason you save money, even though you're giving people better coverage, is because you are cutting out all of those administrative costs. You are saying, we're going to pay for what your doctor says you need and not going to spend money going back and forth trying to fight over what coverage you actually get. So this is why people say it saves money. This is why studies say it saves money and lives, by the way. Almost 70,000 lives will be saved every year, in addition to almost $500 million every year. So we are going to pay for it exactly how we pay for healthcare now, but we're going to save money, and we're going to ensure that those costs are shared across all of us. When it comes to a Green New Deal, I mean, I talked about these taxes that people propose. I talked about how they're regressive. They put too much of the weight on individuals rather than the corporations that have actually caused the vast majority of our carbon problem, and doesn't actually change any of the structure. It doesn't actually enact any of the structural change that we need. Because if you throw a tax on gas, people who can afford it will continue to pay it, and people who can't will struggle, but probably still have to continue to pay it just because they need to heat their home or cook on their stove or light their house or fill up their gas tank. So you are putting the onus on the wrong people, but you're not actually changing the structure of the system. And that's truly what we need. We need to end our dependence on fossil fuels, and carbon taxes and gas taxes do not get us there. And when it comes to a Green New Deal, we are talking about creating jobs, bolstering our economy. Like, if you're concerned about what it costs, think about what it's going to cost us when a state like Delaware is 10% underwater in a generation, when the port of Wilmington no longer is usable because it's been flooded out, when our farms are gone, when our beaches are destroyed, when storms come through every single summer that destroy our coastlines and our cities and our land and our homes. Like, these things cost money, and they cost the economy. And what we could be doing is saying, yes, change is going to come no matter what, but we're going to lead on that change, and we're going to be that change, and we're going to say we're going to get ahead of this. And the change is going to be that we're going to guarantee every single person in this in this country who wants one, a job. And we're going to bolster the economy that way. And we're going to be the leaders in this space. Like, I don't understand why we would say we don't want to lead on the green technology that's necessary. Why wouldn't we want to invest in the innovation and the research that's required to figure out how to make this happen, and then be the people who provide that technology to everyone else in the world? This is something that I understand there's an upfront investment, but the benefits of making that investment grossly outweigh allowing ourselves to be completely destroyed by climate change. So again, this is something that we need to choose to invest in, because it will actually bolster our economy, save lives, make our country better, be able to guarantee a dignified standard of living and a well-paying job to anyone who wants one. These are the types of things our government should actually exist to do. Okay, so next question is kind of back to the conversation we've been having about police brutality. All right, so how do you interpret defund the police, and what are your stances on how policing should be changed when it comes to reform versus abolition? So what's been, I think I mentioned this last week too, but what has been incredibly interesting is that the calls that we're hearing from people who are protesting, it's really not about reform anymore, because we've given reform a chance. Chokeholds are already banned in New York. Didn't save Eric Garner's life. Like, a lot of the things that come out as these reforms are essentially unenforceable, because a lot of them are already in place and they're not saving people's lives. And then a lot of them require more investment in policing. You know, that's where something like body cams gets you. First of all, body cameras are marketed to police departments as a way to, like, protect themselves. They have access to the video before anyone else does. They can form their story around that video. And then what ends up happening is you have to buy the cameras. That's a cost that we're now investing in policing again. Taking that away, finding that budget money somewhere and taking it away from something else. And you have to store that video. Another cost that's ongoing. So when we look at reforms, when we look at things like training, bringing in consultants to train people, again, costly, and has proven to be ineffective. So a lot of the reforms that we are seeing, or used to see people call for, are no longer being called for because people recognize that they are ineffective and they require spending more money on policing, which takes away money from the places that people want to invest. And that's where the concept of defunding comes in. It means that we no longer vote at a city level, at a state level, at whatever municipality level, to constantly increase the funding that goes toward policing, so that they can buy military equipment, so that they can buy, I'm sure people have seen these sound devices that can destroy your hearing, so that they can outfit themselves like an occupational force at the cost of everything else, at the cost of schools and public works and housing and all parks and recreations and everything else that we could be investing in. So there's a lot of things that reform just won't fix like that. So what activists in particular have been fighting for years, and now they're like having their calls heard, is for starting to actually shift that money in a different direction. And to say, so the idea of defunding police is really about saying policing does not create public safety, and investing in the things that create safety are actually where we should be spending that money. So it means shifting the budgets away and saying we're going to invest in our schools, that we're going to invest in healthcare, childcare, jobs, and more social services. It means having, I saw people commenting on a post about this, that kids go to school where there's a police officer but not a social worker or a counselor. Like, that's a failure. We need to make sure that those services are available to every single person in our community. We don't have enough social workers that are capable of doing that work. So that is really what we're talking about. We're talking about investing in the things that will actually address root causes of crime to decrease crime, rather than just constantly policing communities that we've labeled crime-ridden, because policing doesn't actually fix those problems. And instead, we can use our shared resources to actually address those root causes of crime. I mean, I think I've mentioned this, that Wilmington, when you look at, there was a study done with 2016 data, and the data from 2016 showed that Wilmington was spending more on policing per capita than any other city that was in the study, but our outcomes were worse. As we just kept increasing funding for policing, our crime rate increased right along with it. So we can see that putting more money into this same system is not working. We need to say, what is it else that we can fund? What else can we invest in that actually will keep people safer, that will take away the causes of crime in people's lives, and build a better city and state. All right. So question, do we know if anyone has ever asked Coons if he supports opening investigations to press charges for these shootings in Delaware? That is actually something that came up at the protest on Friday. Not specifically about Senator Coons, but that a man spoke who took on Yahim Harris's case and got it thrown out. And that he mentioned at the protest that he was, I guess, either in contact with, or the Attorney General herself just announced that they were going to be looking into the Jeremy McDowell case as well. So there are pushes, I think, as we continue to talk about these things, to investigate what actually happened here, that were not done at the time of the violence. There we get these internal investigations that stay behind, sometimes it's called that, like, blue wall of silence, where the structure is set up to protect police rather than hold police accountable or eradicate police from the force that use violence repeatedly in particular. So it does sound like there's hopefully going to be some investigation into the Jeremy McDowell case now. Okay. So another question about just policing in Delaware. I don't know much about police departments in Delaware. How would you say they compare to use of force, policy, accountability, militarization to the national average? That's a really good question. I know that given the fact that I can rattle off as many names as I can, many of them have happened in the last 12 to 13 months. We know our police departments are using force, and often lethal force. Our incarceration rate is also incredibly high. So we have a rate of we incarcerate in Delaware over 750 people per 100,000 people. And that is a higher rate than many other, like, wealthy democracies. So we have a higher rate than the U.S. Our rate of incarceration is higher than the United States on an average, and the United States has a higher rate of incarceration than every other country. So Delaware is locking up more people than average in America, and since America is already worse than every other country, Delaware is locking up far more people than every other country. So we have an incredibly high incarceration rate in our state, and that incarceration rate, this is not a surprise, but it disproportionately affects black people. So black people make up about 20% of the population in the state of Delaware, but they make up 60% of the incarcerated population. So there's an indication there that there's a inequality. We know that black and white people tend to commit crime at the same rate. However, the neighborhoods that black people live in predominantly, and the communities they live in, are policed to a much higher degree. So they are not committing more crime, they are getting locked up more regularly for it. And that's what we see in our incarceration rates. I think we saw, not last week as much, but the week before, these massive military vehicles rolling out into our city streets. I think that we are just as militarized as every other department, every other state. There was a incident last year where someone was kind of barricaded themselves in a home. They were being evicted, maybe also having a bit of a crisis, and there was responded to with one of those militarized armored MRAP vehicles pulled down a residential street. Like I said at the top, we are just as bad as every other department, every other state on this. We need to be going to our city council meetings, going to county meetings, state level meetings, to have the conversations about how we undo this system, how we get rid of these militarized gear and weapons. I mean, there were pictures this weekend of horses, mounted police, with riot gear face shields on. That's something we have in our state. I mean, horses alone are incredibly expensive just to feed and care for them. Thousands of dollars a month to keep a horse that could be invested differently. So we are absolutely just as bad, if not worse, than average in the country. And there's very little accountability. I mentioned before, we get internal investigations, and when we're talking about that officer who shot both Jeremy McDowell and Yaheem Harris, he's no longer on the force finally, but he was basically allowed to retire with his pension and is not really facing any type of justice for what he did to those people and those families. And that happens far too often. Same thing happens, an officer who was let go from, I believe it was the Dover police force, and because we have no national record of brutality or any accountability, that same officer who was let go because of brutality was hired by another police department in Maryland, where he brutalized someone else. So the lack of accountability, again, it's bad here just as it is everywhere else in the country. So next question is, what's your reaction to what Minneapolis City Council announced about dismantling the police? So this is a great example of kind of what I was talking about at the top, where this is not the time to go home, because what the Minneapolis City Council announced is that they have a veto-proof majority, and they are pledging to disband the police department and rethink what public safety means. But I think it's incredibly important to note that it's a pledge at this point. There hasn't been legislation proposed, there hasn't been a vote. So this is what I'm talking about, where it's important to stay out there. It's important to stay on top of this, because we can't let people get off with a pledge. It has to be actually enacted, and change has to come. But it's the right step. I'm inspired by the fact that they did it. I'm I think we're seeing a few examples of where things are changing. Richmond is another example of where they are enacting a community review board of the police department, as well as enacting a mental health crisis alert that you can use instead of 911 to get a counselor or someone who's trained in psychiatric crisis management to respond rather than an officer. So there are good things happening, but I think that the point is, like, don't take your foot off the gas, because we deserve more and we can fight for more, and we have to actually make sure that the things that people are pledging get carried out. All right. Ooh, okay, this is a good one. Often our leaders implement policies that perpetuate racism in our country. It can be very frustrating to see our white elected officials deny the real consequences of their words or actions when confronted about their inevitable racism. How will you respond when you're asked to challenge the ways racism manifests itself through you? That's an incredibly good question, and I think that from a personal standpoint, I really try to embody not immediately going to a place of defensiveness, because I think that is what happens all too often. Particularly with people who think that, like, they are more anti-racist than the norm, and you sometimes you'll see people get called out for some misstep they make, or something that just had unintended consequences that they weren't aware of, and the reaction is to defend every good thing, defend themselves, trot out every good thing that they've ever done that did work. And I think that I try really hard to not react in that way when I get questioned or called out for something, because no one is going to be perfect at this, and I think it's incredibly important to recognize that in yourself, and recognize that, like, no matter how much work you put in to be a good ally, to be anti-racist, like, all of these things that we absolutely need to do, no matter how much work you're going to put in, I don't think anyone is ever going to fully eradicate their blind spots. And that's why it's incredibly important to have people that surround you, that trust you and you trust them, to call those things out and have a conversation about how you actually fix the problem, not just a conversation about whether it is or is not racist. And I think that's what often ends up happening, is we end up having the wrong conversation. Like, it's irrelevant if I think that something I did or didn't do is racist. If it caused harm to someone, we need to have a conversation about how we fix that harm and repair it and move forward from there, rather than having a debate about whether or not that action was actually racist. So I think that on a personal level is how I think about that. From a kind of campaign level and when elected level, like, structurally, I think it's incredibly important to not think that I have the answers, and that's a place where I'm already working to do that by putting forward policies that are specifically driven by the work that Black activists have been doing in this space. And not trying to come up with my own solutions, because there are people who have been, again, doing this work, who are on the ground and in the trenches and have been fighting for this for years, and now we are making all of ourselves listen to them. So I am trying to pull through their agendas and give them the space to tell me what the policy should look like and what the platform should look like, because I think it's not really for me to decide. It's for me to use the power of my campaign and my seat when I'm elected to shine a light on that work and enact it. And I think that's another place where having a truly grassroots campaign is incredibly important, because that keeps you connected to the people who are your actual constituents and accountable to those people, as opposed to a wealthy donor class who are going to have very different interests, much more corporate interests, much higher wealth and socioeconomic interests that are not going to reflect the needs of the average working person, and particularly not going to reflect, getting back to the conversation about how little representation even exists in places of power, it's certainly not going to reflect the needs of Black people. So that's where canvassing and having town halls and forums and hearing from people directly is important. That's where even like the staff you hire and the people you bring in, like I think surrounding yourself with the right people is incredibly important here. I really I've talked about a lot how I think we need more people in office who are going to bring the mind and the thinking of activism into their seat and continue to surround themselves, like hire actual activists and organizers who care about doing the work, not who care about their ambitions of their career and the seat that they all ultimately want to run for or hold in the future. And I think that there's a lot of people who have jobs in the offices of representatives and senators right now who are a little more focused on what the next job that they can get from that job is, than having issues that they deeply care about and see the ability to use the platform of the office to fix those issues and get work done on them. All right, next question is, how do you differ from Chris Coons when it comes to Black Lives Matter and criminal justice? This is a really great question. I think that this goes back a little bit to what I was saying at the top, is that joining a protest is one thing when you are an elected official, and yes, stand with us, stand in solidarity, sure, but then take some actual actions. You know, one thing Senator Coons said last week is that the painting of the words Black Lives Matter, he posted a photo of that which happened in DC, and they painted the word Black Lives Matter on a city street there, and the senator tweeted about it, saying that we need more than thoughts and prayers, we need action, and this is action. That's not action. That's the equivalent of thoughts and prayers. That's performative things that give off the optics of caring about the cause, that co-opt the language of the cause without actually taking real action, without writing legislation, without doing anything that will actually stop this. And that's a real difference. Like, I would not be taking the votes that he has to militarize the police, to vote for judges who allow for police brutality, who fail to hold dangerous, violent police accountable. I mean, we know that Chris Coons has voted for at least 18 judges who fail to affirm Brown versus Board of Education, which is a incredibly important Supreme Court case that led to civil rights and racial justice, though we obviously aren't there yet, but it was a step forward, and he's voting for judges who don't believe that case was settled properly. As I mentioned, like, I would move toward steps. I would push for defunding police and moving money to social services that we need that actually make us safer. I would move toward actually creating a fair criminal justice system with a focus on restorative justice, not just punitive and carceral justice. I mean, I would not sit on the law enforcement officer caucus as Senator Coons does. I would not take money from the Fraternal Order of Police like Senator Coons does. I would not torpedo. Had I been there, I would not have torpedoed President Obama's nomination of Debo Adegbile to to lead the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice, like Senator Coons did, after he spoke to the Fraternal Order of Police and felt and took their advice to vote against them, join Republicans and vote against Adegbile. These are all things that I would not have done that the senator has done, and has failed to actually stand on the side of constituents who are being brutalized by the police. Okay, so Cheryl asks, I've been a foster mom for over 20 years. Thank you so much, Cheryl, for doing that work. That's wonderful. I would like for you to key in on services for this group, especially after they turn 18 and age out of the system. Not many of us are ready for life at 18. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, very few people can step out at 18 and kind of build a life for themselves, particularly if they don't have that family kind of safety net to turn back to or fall back on. Like, I know I was a 22 and 3-year-old that 23-year-old that had to turn back home after losing my job during the recession. So expecting 18-year-olds to go out on their own and make a life is unbelievable, and we absolutely need services in place there. So some of the key things that I'm fighting for that I think will make a difference for students aging out of foster care is, first of all, guaranteeing housing to every single person in this country. One of the things you obviously lose when aging out of foster care is a place to live. We need to make sure that there's a transition there, that we are not just leaving it up to that teen to figure out who they need to contact, but actually setting up that housing for them and transitioning and creating that transition plan for them. I'm also an advocate and a supporter of tuition-free college and trade schools, so that an 18-year-old who just came out of the foster care system doesn't have to figure out how to try to fund an education to take advantage of the opportunity that an education creates. Still, Medicare for all is incredibly important here, like making sure that they are able to go to the doctor when they need to, making sure that they can get mental health services if needed. Again, that's a very difficult transition to make, and making sure that there's guidance and someone to help them through that, and ensuring that jobs actually pay wages that people can live on. You know, guaranteeing a minimum wage of at least $15 an hour will be much different to a young person that's getting out on their own for the first time, making sure that they actually have wages that they can afford to pay for food and bills and clothing and anything that they may need to survive. So I think those are some of the key things that I'm pushing for that would make a difference in the lives of kids coming out of foster care. And I really think that ensuring that there's a plan there and someone there to help with the transition from sort of one service to the next is incredibly important there too. But again, thank you, Cheryl, for doing that work. So Thomas said, and I assume this is in response to questions about changes to policing, he said, so will civilians be able to arm themselves with firearms to protect themselves? Civilians can already legally arm themselves. I believe my stance on, guns is that we need to ensure that owners of guns have safe training. And that can be federally funded safe training programs, that we ensure that if we are guaranteeing the right to gun ownership, that we're also saying that we need to make sure that people know how to use guns, requiring storage training, usage training. That's that there. So Paige asked a question about, wouldn't you be afraid that defunding police would only make their issues worse? I feel like they need more funding to get through the additional education and training they need. This is a little bit of what I touched on before. The problem is that a lot of the training that we do now, that we pay, when we pay a consultant to come give implicit bias training, that's money that we're spending and it's ineffective. So the training that happens right now and a lot of the training that is on the market for policing is ineffective, and there's some training that frankly is like given by former military personnel that talks about how to act like a warrior that cops are sometimes going to get that type of training. These are not things that we need. I will say, I do think that where training comes in, we should talk about the amount of hours that go into training to become an officer. Right now, you do less hours of training to become a police officer than you do to become a hairdresser. And, a woman recently, I heard her say that she's going to become a lawyer and it's going to take her, 7 to 8 years to be able to do that job. And her question was, why is it that police officers can be on the street with a deadly weapon within 3 to 6 months? So that's a place where I think that we can talk about changing the training. But I think we have to be really thoughtful about what we're talking about when we say training, because I do think that there's something to saying the amount of time that it takes to become a police officer should probably be longer, especially given the comparison to some of these other jobs where you don't have the ability to kill someone. But I don't think we should be investing in these kind of bias trainings and the ones that have kind of proven to be ineffective, that police departments have been doing for years, that have not made a difference. And I do stand by the idea that like what we need to be doing is working toward a city, state, society, whatever, that has less crime. And you get there by providing the social services that are necessary to guarantee a good standard of living to every single person. Something I keep seeing going around that I think is important to remember is that the safest communities are not the ones with the most police, they're the ones with the most resources. So how do we ensure that we are giving those resources to the communities that need them the most to actually make them safer? All right, so coming up on the end here, I think this will probably be our last question. David asks, what do you think about the idea of a universal basic income? This has come up a lot, and I know, particularly when we're looking at the response to coronavirus and how so many people were calling for essentially a basic income through this period. I think that we're going to continue to have conversations about this, and I think my perspective is that it is a good tool to guarantee everyone a dignified standard of living, but it often gets pushed as the only tool, and I think it's incredibly important to not go down that route. Like, I don't want a universal basic income if it means that we're getting rid of Medicaid or Medicare or other social services like food stamps, food assistance, those types of things, like assistance for needy families. Like, it won't fill the gap on its own. So I think that it's incredibly important to talk about it and how it fits in with a larger set of social programs, so that we don't get a situation where it's seen as enough, because I really don't believe that it will be enough to deliver on the standard of living that I think we need to guarantee every single person in our country on its own. I still want to make sure that everyone has health care. Like, if you get sick, and while you do have a universal basic income, you probably will not be in a place where you can still afford to get the care that you need. So I think that we have to say yes and to UBI and say absolutely, but how do we continue to build out that foundation that we offer every single person in our country that they can jump off of to build a good life and have a good life. So I think I'll close there. Thank you so much. These are really great questions. I think, I kind of joked that when I started, I was like, I don't know if anyone will actually want to ask questions, but everyone always shows up with like really great questions every week, and I really genuinely appreciate it. This is one of my favorite things that we've been doing, and I think even, I might like to keep doing it even after we get back out there to canvassing, because I think it's a really great opportunity to connect. So thank you all for joining. Just want to give a thanks again to everyone who organized the rally and the march on Friday, the We Still Can't Breathe march that I attended, and then thank you to the people who organized protests up and down the state. There were ones in Newark and Middletown and Sussex County and all across the state, and I think that has just been so inspiring to see that people are showing up over and over to continue to demand change, and that it's not just happening in big cities or a few places. Like, it's happening all over states like ours, and it's incredibly important to keep showing up and keep demanding these things. It is June 8th, so we are 3 months and a week from our primary election, which is wild to me. This is an important time. This is when people start thinking about elections, start making up their minds about who they are voting for, and it's critical that we make sure that everyone in the state of Delaware knows about our platform and knows about this campaign. So it's incredibly important that we keep building our volunteer network, and keep, right now while we are not canvassing, keep making calls. When we get back out there, keep knocking on doors, because it really is our goal to make sure that we talk to every single voter in this state. Like, we set that as a goal in the beginning, and we want to fulfill it, because we recognize that when we have conversations with voters, this is the world that they want to see, and we need to let them know that there's someone here to fight for it with them. So we need everyone. Please sign up to volunteer. You can go to jessfordelaware.com/volunteer, sign up. We'll get you trained. You get to go in our Slack and join us on our team meetings on Wednesdays, which are a great time. I'm biased, but we're a great group, and I'm really happy about the team and the camaraderie that we've built on this team, and I'd love to have you join us and be a part of it. So jessfordelaware.com/volunteer to become a volunteer. Another great way to help is to donate. Every phone call that we make costs money, so it always helps that if you're able to donate to help us reach more people, you can do that and chip in at jessfordelaware.com/donate. And I'll be back next Monday and come up with more questions, and we'll talk, and I hope to see you there. Thanks so much, and have a great evening. Bye.